19%.
Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. The issue of the government's fiscal performance stands at the centrepiece of this debate, and I think it is very important that we remember our history in this. During the 9 years of the Labor-led government, every budget paid down debt. They ran 9 years of surpluses, and the current Minister of Finance voted against every budget. And the reason he voted against every budget is he said that the surplus should be given away in tax cuts to upper-income earners. That was the argument that Bill English and John Key made day after day, year after year, during the years of that Labor-led government. And you'd have to give credit to Michael Cullen and Helen Clark, and well, we had differences with that Labor government. The fact remains that the reason why the incoming National Party government did have a buffer was because Mr Cullen paid down debt rather than giving the surpluses away as tax cuts to upper-income earners. That is just an historic fact. And Mr English voted against every one of those budgets because they didn't give the surplus away in tax cuts to the wealthy. Instead, they paid down debt. And then Mr English takes over as Finance Minister after the GFC and then the earthquakes. And he is able to use the fact that the previous government reduced debt in order to buffer the effects of those two events. And yet he continually criticises the previous government. The only reason that Mr English has the buffer is because the previous government ignored Mr English's advice and paid down debt instead of giving away tax cuts to upper-income earners. So then we move into the current government, and now we've had these 5 budgets. So the budgets that Mr English votes in favour of are budgets that increase debt. Budgets that give away tax cuts to upper-income earners. The cost of the tax cut to the top 10% of income earners is $1.1 billion every year, which has had to be borrowed every year to pay for those tax cuts for the top 10% of income earners. Think about the priorities of this government when we have 300,000 children living in poverty, that the priorities for spending borrowed money by the incoming government and the Finance Minister was to spend it on tax cuts for the top 10% of income earners. Well, we have 300,000 kids living in poverty. We have all of those kids who say they can't get to school in the rain because they can't afford raincoats, who are going to school without lunches, who are going hungry, who aren't learning in our education system because the government's priority, the National Party's priority, is to give tax cuts to the top 10% instead of putting food into the bellies of poor children so that they learn properly. And when the Green Party puts up a policy that would put food in the bellies of poor children so that they can learn properly, get an opportunity to escape poverty by getting an education, the government says it's too expensive. Our policy would cost $100 million a year. The tax cuts to the top 10% cost $1.1 billion per year. That is about values. The Green Party has values that says we should support poor kids to get an education. The National Party has values that says we should give money to the richest people in the country through tax cuts. That is about the differing values that are reflected in financial priorities between the National Party government, the government of borrow and borrow and borrow and give it to the wealthy, and a Green Party policy which is let's put food in the bellies of poor kids so that they can get an education, so they can get an opportunity like we all had. Lots of us in this House got an opportunity through education so that we could escape poverty. Lots of people in New Zealand had that opportunity. This government doesn't want to give it to poor kids. They've introduced national standards, for goodness sake, which mean that teachers are now having to neglect poor children in their classes in lower decile schools because they can't afford to spend the time on those poor children because they have to try to get the kids that are near the national standard over the line. So what it means is that poor kids not only are hungry at school now, they get less of the teacher time because national standards tells teachers to focus their work just on the kids that might be pushed over the standard so that their numbers can look good. So once once again, poor children are left to rot by this government. That is their priority, instead of spending it where it's needed to help out those kids so they can get a foot on a ladder of opportunity and get an education because they're not hungry all the time. Instead, the government gives tax cuts to the top 10% that are costing $1.1 billion every year. That's $1,100 million every year is the cost of the tax cuts to upper income earners. All that money has to be borrowed. Is that really the right priority for New Zealand?
Mr. Chair, I call the Honourable John Banks.
Speaker.
Mr. Chair.